trying to build up a resistance to you, but I'm having very little luck.
I do have a lot of fun writing these books. Yeah, yeah.
So we've got the two brothers, and the oldest one is suddenly reluctantly found himself the heir to this pile because his younger brother, a World War I hero, older brother, sorry,
has died.
He's what, the middle brother?
He's the younger brother, and so that's why he inherits.
Right.
And the older brother's son is the one who was killed.
Exactly.
So
well, what I meant was that the heirs in front of him have all been killed off in the war.
The heirs have managed to fall to the wayside, leaving Mahmud.
Right.
Yes.
And so while Mahmud was actually one of those kind of younger sons that the empire was there in part to absorb.
He was the spare, the heir and the spare. He was the spare.
And so it was okay for him to go off and pose as, you know, as a Bedouin in Palestine all this time. All of a sudden, the ties of blood,
oops,
yep, draw him back. And it turns out that his, quote, brother is actually his cousin, right?
Yeah.
He's not his brother. The younger, the one, Ali, who we thought
yes.
was the younger brother, is actually in the...
I'm glad you're keeping track of this.
He's in the cadet side of the family.
Yeah.
He is a cousin. And neither of them, after all these years of glorious freedom, you know, roaming the world under sheets and being Bedouins now, has the least interest in being a proper British gentleman in darkest Bedfordshire. It's pretty dark, by the way, in Bedfordshire, the way you write it. And one of them is, in fact, sort of dying of melancholy because he just can't hack it. And so your challenge in this book is to either accustom them to this role or, knowing you, and I couldn't figure out how you were going to do it, possibly get them off the hook so they could go back to Palestine.
And it was, I mean, one of the trickiest parts of the book for me in English, you know, my concept of the ruling classes in England is pretty thin. One of the most difficult parts was to sort out the inheritance laws.
Right.
In order to, because otherwise you can imagine the letters I would get. You know, women can't inherit title. They can inherit property, but not title. So you've got to find the male somewhere, you know, somewhere back there.
Right. Well, they can, but it takes an act of parliament or other things. I mean, there are cases when the woman actually can. The Marlboroughs, you actually.
But there are not.
They're thin on the ground.
So you have to find a male somewhere. And so that's why, you know, fictionally they're always bringing in somebody from the colonies.
Right.
So that, for example, in the Baskerville family, Sir Henry is brought over from the colonies because he wasn't needed there until...
Right. He was the heir of the spare.
Yeah. So, you know, sorting out exactly how it would work. If you have a Mad Duke, can you sort of remove him from the throne? Well, no, you can't. You just have a Mad Duke.
He's the one that gets locked in the attic.
Yeah, yeah, and then you have people who run the estate for him. So that if you have someone who really doesn't want it, he can't get rid of the title, but he can allow someone else to take the position until he dies. You know, he can find his heir, name his heir, allow his heir to take over all of his responsibilities, and then just go back to his life. So Holmes and Russell have to find some way of getting their friend out of this
their friend Mahmoud,
position.
who's dying of melancholia in darkest Bedfordshire. Well, it's
Yeah.
a really challenging exercise, but underneath all this, at the core of this book, is the subject that you found absolutely fascinating, which is what happened to about 300, more than 300 young men who got sucked into the trench warfare and who, for one reason or another, were shot because they failed to perform as soldiers.
The executions of British soldiers, and they were exclusively British and, well, French as well, but none of the colonies, none of the Americans or colonies. One or two Indians, but mostly the Australians and New Zealanders would have nothing of capital punishment. They wouldn't stand for this. But 304, I think it is, British soldiers who, most of whom suffered from shell shock, downed their guns and ran. And they had basically no trial, no representation. They were simply accused, went under trial with a handful of officers, and summarily taken off and blindfolded and shot at dawn.
Right, and this was all really on the battlefield, so there were
Yeah.
there was no legal representation, nobody to stand up
No
for
court
them.
of appeal, no nothing. And in fact, the men still haven't been pardoned. There's a group in England who are trying to get a blanket pardon, and they still haven't been, including a 17-year-old boy, 17 years old,
Drafted.
panicked under months of rolling bombardment, panicked and ran. Well, if he'd been an aristocrat, he wouldn't have been shot, because there were only, I think there were 3 second lieutenants in the whole period who were executed.
So these were basically all
They were
privates.
all, yeah, a few sergeants and mostly privates.
Right. It's a really tragic story, and
Yeah.
that's when we come back to where we were sort of early in this discussion, is you always have this content, often a surprising content, you know, to your books. And I could really feel your moral outrage when I read that. And it's a very powerful book.
Yeah. I think as a writer, I like to have things that I feel strongly about, so long as they don't smell of the soapbox. There's nothing that kills a story faster than saying, you must listen to this and you must believe it, because I'm right. On the other hand, you have to feel passionately, and you have to show characters who feel passionately, because otherwise the story, why bother?
Well, that's absolutely true. And of course, part of the trick, too, is to make sure that this content part fits naturally into the story. I mean, so that it isn't like a break where you're waving a flag and
Right.
saying, you know, whatever. And the particular story you've devised does feed in, this all feeds into it. And I think it's a tremendous book. I really,
Thank you.
well, I want to thank you. It was terrific. I've let us run out of time, so I will briefly say that you have also written some short stories in addition to this amazing bulk of work. And one other triumph, which we could touch on for 1 second, I know.
Yeah.
You were the person chosen to write the last chapter in
No,
a
no.
serial novel.
Let's get this clear.
Right, you volunteered,
I
didn't
was
you?
the fool who volunteered to write the final chapter in the serial novel. Yeah.
Called,
Naked Came the Phoenix.
and your challenge was to make sense out of the other 11 contributions.
To take the other, well, there were, yeah, we were a baker's dozen, to take the other 12 people, and all of whom had deliberately taken the most likely candidate as whodunit and killed them off. I mean, this is one of the responsibilities in the serial novel, is that you have to look around, see where it's leading, and immediately chop it off, leaving the poor sot on the end to say, but there's nobody left.
That's right.
And you've got all these weird clues, like a yellow polka dot bikini bottom and a bottle of whiskey that's at, you know, all these odd. So I had to finalize it.
Well, I can tell that you consider this a real tour de force on your part. And I have to admit that it was. It started out with Nevada Barr, if I recall.
Right,
And
she
you-
started it.
And you had people like Val McDermott
And Lisa Scottolini.
Lisa
and
Scottolini and J.D. Robb and Faye Kellerman and J.A. Jance. Marcia Talley was kind of the overall editor.
Yeah.
It was a breast cancer awareness project, right?
Right.
It was a charity book.
Yeah, we gave part of the profits to charity. In fact, it's coming out in paperback, I understand.
Yeah, well, it did extremely well as a hardcover. Actually, I thought it was a lot of fun.
It was.
But to get all the way from Nevada's setup to your, you know, to your wrap-up was an amazing thing.
Yeah.
And it's important to point out that a serial novel, as you suggest, is in theory a single, you know, it's a novel. It's not a series of short stories. It's not a collection of separate short stories. It is supposed to have a single plot stream.
Although you're not allowed to go back and tidy it up if you don't like what someone else has done.
True.
I mean,
It's
that's
immutable,
the rule.
right.
You have to accept what someone's done. Very small cosmetic changes can be allowed. You know, things
Right.
that they haven't noticed, and they've introduced a character who's gone to Nevada or something. But you're allowed to make very small changes, but nothing major. And so,
So you rose to the occasion. I will say this, Laurie R. King, that if there was a woman who could do it, it was you.
thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, love. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you again.
As always.
And I thank all of you for coming to join us on the Criminal Calendar. I'm sorry.